You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. It was the first day of school in September of 2012, and a 16-year-old girl named Emma stood at her locker in the tiny town of Thief River Falls, Minnesota. She had volleyball practice next, so she threw a water bottle, a deodorant stick, hair ties, and a few other items into her backpack. Emma was excited that summer was over and they were back in school, but really just because she was excited about sports, not so much for her classes. She had made the varsity volleyball team, and now she was anxious to get on the court with her teammates. Emma looked in the tiny mirror mounted on the inside of her locker door, and immediately she grimaced at her reflection. She touched up her eyeliner and pulled her hair back into a tight ponytail. Her acne was flaring up again, even though she was taking medication for it, so she put on some concealer to cover it up. Then she threw the makeup into her backpack and shut her locker. A few minutes later, Emma walked into the noisy school gymnasium and dropped her backpack behind the bleachers. She could hear the familiar squeaking of sneakers and the smacking of volleyballs as her friends warmed up for practice. Emma felt right at home as she ran out to join them. But about halfway through the practice, Emma began to feel really tired. And not the normal kind of tired from like working out or running around. Her feet felt really heavy and her heart was pounding. When she looked around, she saw her teammates did not seem tired, so Emma just pushed herself and continued running all the drills. But after a few more minutes, she felt so winded that she just had to stop. And so her teammates rushed past her as Emma knelt down on one knee to catch her breath. Emma was used to feeling very fit and strong, but now her chest felt tight and she could barely breathe. She staggered to her feet and stumbled over to the bleachers. Emma's head felt heavy as she held it in her hands. She felt a sharp pain in her throat every time she swallowed, and now she was starting to feel scared. Her coach walked over and asked Emma if she was okay. Emma silently shook her head no. Her coach placed the back of her hand on Emma's forehead, and she told Emma she was burning up and suggested she go home and rest. Emma nodded and then stood and slowly shuffled around the bleachers to pick up her backpack. She dug out her phone from inside and then called her mom and then told her she wasn't feeling good and needed to come home early. When Emma's mother arrived, she felt her daughter's forehead and saw she was burning up, so she drove Emma right to their family doctor. The doctor took Emma's vitals and discovered she definitely had a fever, with a temperature of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. So she was sick for sure. He tested to see if Emma had strep throat, a common illness among teenagers, but the test was negative. After reviewing her charts for a few minutes, the doctor explained to Emma and her mother that Emma probably had a fast-moving viral infection. He told her to go home and rest and that her symptoms should clear up in a couple of days. Emma was glad to hear that it wasn't anything serious. She didn't want to miss a lot of volleyball practices. But when Emma woke up the next day, she felt more tired than she ever had in her whole life. It was like her limbs just didn't want to move, and her lungs could barely take in any air. Emma cried out for her parents, Janet and Martin, and a few seconds later they ran into Emma's room, and the second they saw how sick Emma looked, they told her, "We're going to the emergency room right now." During the 25-mile drive to the hospital, Emma struggled to breathe. By the time they finally arrived, Emma was gasping for air as hospital staff helped her out of the car and onto a gurney. As a nurse wheeled Emma into a room, her mother squeezed her hand and her father followed close behind. The nurse's soft voice was very comforting as she asked Emma questions, but Emma struggled to answer even simple ones like where did she go to high school? Emma vaguely felt the prick of a needle in the crook of her elbow as the nurse attached an IV and drew several vials of blood. Then the nurse placed an oxygen mask over Emma's nose and mouth and picked up a phone. Emma could hear the seriousness in the nurse's voice. She wondered if maybe this was just how nurses sounded in the ER, or maybe this was something really bad. A few minutes later, the nurse wheeled her gurney to a room down the hall and positioned a large X-ray machine over Emma's chest while she lay there. Emma knew that the X-rays could not actually hurt her, but as the machine began to click and hum, Emma really started to feel terrified. What was wrong with her? When the nurse wheeled Emma back to her room after the X-ray, She turned down the harsh overhead lights and told Emma to rest while they waited for the results. Emma was grateful for the peace and quiet. She closed her eyes and immediately sank into a deep sleep. An hour later, Emma was startled awake as a doctor wheeled in a computer and dimmed the overhead lights, pulling up a digital image of her chest. Janet and Martin, Emma's parents, stood up from their chairs in the corner of the room as the doctor began to point to all these dark, cloudy spots on the image. The doctor told Emma and her parents that the grayish cloud on her lungs indicated a severe case of pneumonia. The doctor explained that they could treat the pneumonia with drugs, but the big question was what caused Emma's lungs to become so infected. It could be a bacteria, a virus, a fungus, or something else. Hopefully more tests would help them figure it out. But the doctor said that this small regional hospital was not equipped to run those type of tests. He was arranging for Emma to be transferred to the Sanford Medical Center in Fargo, North Dakota, almost 100 miles away. It was the closest hospital with a pediatric intensive care unit. Emma grabbed onto her mother's hand as an orderly came to wheel her into another ambulance. Volleyball practice suddenly seemed very far away. About 2 hours later, a physician at Sanford Medical named Dr. Sherry Richards rushed down the busy hall in the pediatric ICU and into Emma's room. Emma's mom sat next to her sleeping daughter, brushing hair out of Emma's face, while her father sat in the corner, anxiously bouncing his leg. Dr. Richards introduced herself to the parents and then walked up to examine Emma. And right away, she noticed Emma had very shallow breathing and bluish lips and fingertips, and then she gently touched Emma's hand and it was cold. These were all symptoms of Emma's pneumonia. Dr. Richards smiled at Janet and Martin and told them she was going to prescribe powerful antibiotics to suppress the infection in Emma's lungs. Now, she wasn't sure exactly what was causing the infection, but these antibiotics covered a broad spectrum of disease-causing agents, so hopefully the drugs would help Emma start to feel better, while Dr. Richards continued to look for more specific answers. But the next morning, less than 48 hours after Emma initially felt ill, her condition only seemed to be getting worse. She had an extremely high fever, and her breathing was shallow and rapid, and so very little oxygen was reaching her bloodstream. Dr. Richards needed to do something drastic. She asked Emma's parents for permission to place Emma on a ventilator, a machine that forces air into the lungs when someone is struggling to breathe. Emma would need to have a tube inserted through her windpipe so enough air and oxygen could reach her lungs. Her parents hated the idea, but watching Emma gulping for air, they told the doctor to do whatever it took to help their daughter. Dr. Richards checked in on Emma every day, hoping that with more oxygen, Emma's lungs would get better. But even with the help of the ventilator, Emma wasn't recovering. Emma's heart and other organs were not getting enough oxygen to function properly. Dr. Richards was perplexed. She said to a nurse how incredibly rare it was for a young, athletic high school student to be put on a ventilator. Sudden respiratory failure like this did not just happen out of the blue. The most likely cause for what was happening to Emma would be some kind of viral or bacterial infection, but Dr. Richards thought that was unlikely for one simple reason. None of her schoolmates were getting sick. It was just Emma. So Dr. Richards took a closer look into Emma's patient history to see if there was anything about her on an individual level that could spark any clues. By all accounts, she seemed like your average teenage girl whose only regular medication was a very common acne treatment, meaning it was extremely unlikely that Emma's current condition was caused by a rare side effect from this acne treatment. Also, Emma did not have any relevant allergies either. So, to cover all her bases, Dr. Richards ordered a wide range of tests. She wondered if maybe the respiratory issues were caused by a blood clot in Emma's lungs, or maybe she had undiagnosed rheumatoid arthritis that scarred her lungs. But every test Dr. Richards ran on Emma just came back negative. Dr. Richards was totally stumped. And so she suspected that whatever was happening to Emma had to be extremely rare. It was so uncommon she couldn't find any existing records of similar cases anywhere, which also meant she couldn't find a way to treat it. It quickly became obvious that the ventilator was not enough to stabilize Emma's breathing. After a few days, Dr. Richards switched her to a more powerful ventilator that pumped even more air into her lungs, but even that was still not enough. There was only one option left, a very powerful machine that is normally reserved for patients on the brink of death. A team from the famed Mayo Clinic flew to Fargo with a high-tech, refrigerator-sized device known as an ECMO machine. All the blood in Emma's body would now circulate through this ECMO machine, which essentially takes over the job of her heart and lungs. The ECMO machine required surgery to insert all the thin plastic tubes into Emma's body, and her mother immediately gave permission to do the surgery, knowing this could be Emma's only hope. As soon as Emma's surgery was done and she was successfully hooked up to the ECMO machine, Dr. Richards arranged to fly her back to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. There, Emma would be under the care of specialists who had experience treating patients who were as critically ill as Emma was. But this also meant she would now be 400 miles away from her home. As Dr. Richards watched the team roll Emma and the giant ECMO machine toward the airplane, she shook her head at the danger her young patient now faced. She was convinced that Emma's heart, lungs, and kidneys were so damaged that they would never function again without the help of this machine. Now, Emma's only hope of getting off the ECMO machine was to get new organs. But the wait for a 3-organ transplant could take months that she might not have. For now, the ECMO was saving Emma's life, but there was a catch. The longer she had to wait for new organs, the greater risk that she would die. Once Emma was settled in at the Mayo Clinic, her new doctor explained the situation to her. She was at the top of the priority list to receive her new organs, but there was no telling how long that might take. Emma fought to keep her emotions under control. In just a few short weeks, she'd gone from the varsity volleyball team to needing a machine to stay alive. It was almost overwhelming to process. But Emma refused to lay back and mope. She was determined to regain control of something in her life. So she told her doctor she wanted to walk. She saw the doctor look at her with amazement. He encouraged her to go for it, but he also gently told Emma that given her condition, he wasn't sure that she could even muster the energy to stand, let alone take a step. And even if she could, she'd have to drag along this massive ECMO machine and all the tubes and monitors that came with it. But as an athlete, Emma was familiar with the importance of a good attitude. She knew she was physically weak, but she was also very determined. With enough time and effort, she was certain she could eventually walk on her own. So Emma asked some nurses to help her sit up and place her feet on the floor. She was so dizzy that her head spun, and she had to lie down again almost immediately. But Emma refused to give up. She tried again the next day and sat on the edge of the bed a little longer. And the next day, she sat for even longer. Eventually, Emma was strong enough that she was able to actually stand up, albeit she had to hold on to her mom for support. And then it wasn't long after that Emma was straight up walking out of her room and standing in the hall without her parents' help. Finally, Emma managed to make it all the way down the 60-foot-long corridor to the hospital chapel. And there, Emma tasted her first solid food since she'd been hooked up to the ECMO machine. It was just a communion wafer, but Emma could not believe how good that dry, stale cracker tasted. One morning, after more than 6 months at the Mayo Clinic, Emma's doctor came into her room to review the latest readout from her ECMO machine. As he walked over to it, he smiled down at Emma, who was in bed tapping on her phone. The doctor felt so bad for Emma because she was in this impossible situation, but he was also very proud of Emma for really handling this situation with grace. She was so optimistic and so positive, even though most people would be totally devastated and depressed. The doctor looked at the numbers from the ECMO machine and had to do a double take. He wondered if he was actually misreading the data. Emma looked up from her phone and asked him what was going on, and Emma's doctor told her that her blood pressure, heart rate, and blood oxygen levels all seemed to be improving. He had no explanation for why this was happening, but given the numbers he was seeing, Emma's organs might have recovered enough to function without the help of the ECMO. Doctors still had no idea what had made Emma sick in the first place, but almost miraculously, she appeared to be getting over it. After more than 6 months on the ECMO machine, the tubes in Emma's body were finally removed and she was officially disconnected from the machine. She never got a transplant because she didn't need one. Her organs had mysteriously recovered all on their own. Finally, on a spring day in 2013, Emma left the hospital for good. She had been in the hospital for a total of 7 months with a mystery disease that had baffled some of the best doctors in the world. Now, Emma could return to normal life as an active teenager. But a dark shadow hung over Emma. The doctors had never figured out what was making her sick. So what was to stop it from striking her again, or somebody else in the future? 2 years later, Emma and her parents returned to the Mayo Clinic for a checkup. She'd been coming every 6 months since being discharged, and so far there were no lingering issues from her mystery disease. Emma cheerfully greeted the medical staff as a nurse led her down the hospital's halls into an exam room. While the nurse took Emma's vitals, she remarked how happy all the staff was that Emma had made this full recovery, but then the nurse's face grew serious. The nurse told Emma that there was actually a 12-year-old girl at the hospital currently being treated for the same bizarre symptoms that Emma had experienced. Her lungs had stopped working and nobody knew why, and just like Emma had been, this 12-year-old was currently hooked up to an ECMO machine while awaiting an organ transplant. Emma was shocked to hear this. She held back tears as the memories of her own time on the ECMO machine came flooding back to her. She wanted to do everything she could to help this girl, and so Emma asked if maybe she could meet with the girl's parents. And sure enough, a couple of hours later, Emma and her parents sat down with the 12-year-old girl's parents in the hospital cafeteria. And over some hot coffee, they compared their respective histories. At first, the two girls' cases didn't seem to actually have that much in common. But then, Emma remarked that she hoped this other girl at least didn't have the same skin problems that she, Emma, had dealt with when she was younger. The girl's mom laughed and said that her daughter had acne, but not any worse than any other teenager. The mother said that she was taking some medication for it, but it was an extremely common medication. It would turn out that both this girl and Emma were taking the same acne medication, called Bactrim, also known generically as TMP-SMX. The families would shake hands and go their separate ways, and then unfortunately, the 12-year-old girl would eventually die from the mystery condition. Three years later, in March of 2018, Emma, who was now 21 years old, sat at her desk in her modest one-bedroom apartment, drinking her morning coffee and reading the news on her laptop. She clicked on a headline and her jaw dropped. She could not believe what she was seeing. It was a story about a 16-year-old high school student in Wichita, Kansas, named Z Uwadya. She was an athlete who played on several sports teams, but then her lungs just suddenly stopped working, and now Z was relying on an ECMO machine to survive. Emma couldn't believe the similarities between Z's story and her own. It made Emma also think back to that little 12-year-old girl who died a couple years back. Since then, Emma had heard about another teenager experiencing the same thing, and she too had also taken Bactrim, or TMP-SMX. Emma wondered if maybe Z, this person in this headline, was taking Bactrim as well. For years now, this suspicion about Bactrim had lingered in the back of Emma's mind, and now she was more certain than ever that this common medication was what had made them all so sick. Emma found an email address for the doctor who was treating Z, and she wrote to her immediately. Dr. Jenna Miller, who was caring for Z at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri, was catching up on paperwork when her inbox pinged. There was a message from a woman named Emma who said that she'd experienced something similar to Z, and she wanted to know if Z had taken Bactrim, because Emma had taken Bactrim, and so maybe that was a commonality. On one level, Dr. Miller thought it was highly unlikely that such a common drug could cause such a horrific reaction. Bactrim, or TMP-SMX, is the 6th most prescribed antibiotic in the entire United States. It's used to treat many different conditions. Then she remembered something. She scoured Z's files to confirm it. For several weeks before Z was admitted to the hospital, she had been suffering from a urinary tract infection. And the antibiotic that she was taking to treat it was Bactrim. Dr. Miller wrote back to Emma and told her that she very well might have just solved the mystery behind Z's condition and Emma's own horrible illness. It turned out all the girls with this mystery illness had taken Bactrim, TMP-SMX, shortly before being hospitalized. And when the doctors examined images of the girls' lung tissue samples, they discovered that they had all suffered the same kind of tissue damage. For some reason, the Bactrim was systematically destroying the cells responsible for breathing. Over the next 4 years, Dr. Miller searched patient records across the country for people who'd suffered inexplicable respiratory failure shortly after taking this drug. They identified 19 other cases, mostly young men and women under the age of 20. 6 had died, including Z. Uwadya. No one knows why the antibiotic sometimes triggers this rare lung destruction, but Dr. Miller and her colleagues suspect that in rare cases, people's bodies have a potentially deadly allergic reaction to the drug. Today, Bactrim, or TMP-SMX, is still widely prescribed, but acute lung failure is now listed as a potential side effect. Emma is now 26 years old, and she works as a nurse who cares for patients who've just had heart and lung transplants. Emma knows that because of her reaction to Bactrim, which caused all this damage in her body, she can never be a serious athlete again. She gets winded after climbing a couple flights of stairs. But considering that she very nearly died, she doesn't mind at all. Located in the middle of America is a little town called Hartford, Wisconsin. Downtown, they have the biggest automobile museum in all of Wisconsin. They also have a bowling alley called Dave's Lanes, which sells cheap beer and the best frozen pizza in town. Around the corner from the museum and Dave's Lanes are 2 other very popular local spots. One is called Scoop DeVille, which is an ice cream parlor that's themed like it's the 1950s, and they specialize in raspberry sundaes. And the other popular spot is called the Mine Shaft, and it's this big family-friendly restaurant that offers comfort food and arcade games. On warmer days, you can find residents of Hartford out on the many walking trails of Woodlawn and Willowbrook, which are 2 big, very well-maintained parks that are right outside of the downtown area. And on virtually any day, whether it's warm or cold, you can find Hartford residents packed into the Shower Arts Center, which is a local theater, to watch the local theater troupe perform. But none of these attractions are why anybody knows about Hartford, Wisconsin. The reason we know about Hartford, Wisconsin is because of Jessie Blodgett. Jessie Blodgett was a miracle. She was born just outside of Atlanta, Georgia in 1994 to her loving parents, Buck and Joy Blodgett. And Buck and Joy, for the longest time, they couldn't have kids. In fact, they were kind of adjusting to their reality that they would not be able to have biological children when Joy discovered she was pregnant. The couple couldn't believe it. It was like the most incredible thing that either of them had ever experienced. Joy would give birth to Jessie at home with no drugs, no doctors, just Buck, his mom, and a midwife. And when little Jessie poked her head into the world for the first time, Buck and Joy fell instantly in love with her. Not long after Jessie's birth, the Blodgett family would leave Atlanta, Georgia, and move to Hartford, Wisconsin. And it was there, inside of their modest 2-story home, about 5 minutes drive from the downtown, that Jessie would grow up. And it was also inside of that modest 2-story home where many years later, Jessie would come face to face with a monster. Jessie was always someone the other kids looked up to. She was a brilliant musician who could sing, and she could play the piano and the violin. One of her very close friends growing up, a girl named Jacqueline Knights, said that whenever she went over to Jessie's house, she would walk in and have to yell at the top of her lungs just to get Jessie's attention because Jessie was permanently playing the piano. But Jessie's musical talents were not the only reason people were attracted to her. From a young age, Jessie became outraged by bullying and unfairness of any kind, And so very quickly, she developed a very strong moral compass. She became a fierce defender of animal rights, environmentalism, sustainability, social justice, and ultimately ending violence against women. By the time she graduated from high school in 2012, Jessie had become very popular amongst her peers and also amongst teachers and parents. Jessie just came off as someone who was wise beyond her years. Jessie always talked about wanting to change the world, and after high school, she kind of figured out how she was going to do that. She decided she would study to become a choir director for either a university or a high school, because through that role, she would be able to teach and mentor upwards of 100 young lives every single year. So in the fall of 2012, Jessie would leave Hartford and head off to the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, which is about an hour southeast of Hartford, and there she would enroll in their musical education program. And during that first year at the school, Jessie did so well in that program that she was offered a talent scholarship for the following year. After wrapping up her incredibly successful freshman year in college, Jessie came back to Hartford, Wisconsin to live with her parents for the summer. Now, unlike other college kids that were back home for the summer, Jessie was not treating this break like it was a vacation. Instead, she decided she would just jump right into her musical education career. And so as soon as she got home, she started her own business, teaching voice and piano and violin to kids in Hartford. And within weeks of starting this brand new business, she had over 25 kids signed up. When Jessie wasn't teaching that summer, she was often writing original music with her friend Dan Bartelt, who was also a very talented local musician. Or when she wasn't doing that, she was rehearsing at the Shower Arts Center, where that summer she had auditioned for and landed a central role in that summer's musical, The Fiddler on the Roof. Jessie was the fiddler, and she was very excited about this. The musical opened to a packed house on Friday, July 12th at 7:30 p.m., and Jessie and the rest of her cast were incredible. And then the next night, July 13th, Saturday, they had another big performance at 7:30 as well. And then on Sunday, July 14th, they had a matinee performance at 2 p.m. After that matinee, Jessie and the rest of her castmates headed off to another cast member's house who had a pool, and they had a big pool party to celebrate the end of their opening weekend. And during this party, Jessie spent half of her time sitting around the pool with her castmates, and the other half of the time she spent petting llamas that were in a nearby field. Jessie would finally leave the party and get back to her parents' house sometime after midnight, and when she went inside, her mother, Joy, was still awake. And so when Joy heard her daughter, she came out to the front of the house, and she was getting ready to ask Jessie, how was the party, when she noticed right away that something was off about Jessie. She looked upset about something. And so Joy asked her, are you okay? And so Jessie looked like she was about to maybe go into a lengthy explanation about why she was feeling the way she was feeling. But ultimately, Jessie just kind of stopped herself, and in a tone that was less upset and more just annoyed, she would tell her mom, the guys in the cast, there are these two older guys that were kind of hitting on me, and those are my friends, and I felt like they were crossing the line, and it was just totally uncomfortable. And so Joy began asking some follow-up questions to get a sense of, how serious this was, and it just seemed like it wasn't that serious. And pretty quickly, the two women said goodnight to each other, and they both retired to their rooms to go to bed. The next morning, Buck and Joy got up fairly early, around 7 a.m., and Jessie, she stayed in bed because her only commitment that day was a lesson she was teaching one of her students at around noon, and they'd be coming by the house for that lesson. And so her parents knew she was sleeping in, and so Buck and Joy, they're kind of going about their morning routine. Buck left ahead of Joy, probably around 7 or 7:30, and then at 8 a.m., Joy, right before she left the house, she brought some laundry up to Jessie's room. And so she opens Jessie's door, she goes inside, Jessie's asleep, and Joy, she puts the laundry down, and she considers going over and waking her daughter up just to say good morning and maybe goodbye. But she thought to herself, Jessie never gets a chance to sleep in. She's always got something going on, and so I'll let her sleep. And so Joy just quietly left the room, she shut the door behind her, and she headed off to work. At around noon, Joy would leave her office and head back home for her lunch break. And so when she walked into her home, she was expecting to see Jessie awake because Jessie had one of her students arriving any time. But when she walked inside, the house was silent. Jessie was not downstairs. She apparently was not awake, and Joy had seen her car out in the driveway, so she knew she hadn't left. And so kind of annoyed, Joy walked to the foot of the stairs and she yelled upstairs for Jessie to wake up. Hey, your student's going to be here any minute. And then Joy left the foot of the stairs and walked into the kitchen and made herself something to eat. After a little while, as she's finishing making her lunch, Joy hears a knock on the front door. And now at this point, Joy is really annoyed because Jessie has still not made a sound. She has not come downstairs. And so Joy, she goes over to the front door, she opens it up, and sure enough, it's Jessie's student. She asks the student to come inside and wait for a minute. And then Joy hustles up the stairs. She goes right over to Jessie's bedroom. She opens the door up. Jessie's still in bed. And so Joy runs over to her to jostle her awake. But as soon as she is standing right above the bed, right over her daughter, and she has a clear look down at her daughter's face, she freezes. Moments later, she would call 911.
Oh my God.
Hartford 911, what's your emergency?
My daughter is blue. I went to wake her up, and I just got home from lunch, and she won't wake up.
She's
oh
19.
My God.
Okay, hang on just a second.
Okay.
Okay, so is she breathing?
I don't think so, no. Her pants are all wet, and she's got, it looks like strangulation marks.
There are strangulation marks?
That's what it looks like. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on.
Joy would gently pull her daughter out of the bed and lay her down on the ground. She would put a pillow underneath her head, and then she would begin doing chest compressions to try to save her daughter's life. But it was already too late. When police and paramedics arrived moments later, they came into the bedroom and they quickly determined that Jessie was deceased. When police looked at Jessie's body, they too saw the marks on her neck that her mother had referenced on the 911 call, and they also saw the same ligature marks on her left wrist and also on her ankles. As a result of these findings, the police on scene quickly concluded that this was not a naturally occurring death, this was not a suicide, this was a homicide. And so as gently as they could, the police ushered Joy out of her daughter's bedroom and led her downstairs, because at this point, her daughter's bedroom was a crime scene and they needed to keep it pristine so they could find evidence to figure out who did this. Once downstairs, Joy was reunited with her very distraught husband, Buck, who had just come home as well. And the two of them, their life is destroyed. Their beautiful baby girl, their only child, is now suddenly gone, and it didn't make any sense. During the search of Jessie's bedroom and then also the Blodgett house at large, the police were not able to find any cord or rope or ligatures that could have been used to strangle Jessie to death. The police also noted that there was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house, and it appeared nothing in the house was stolen. And so quickly, the lead Hartford police detective named Richard Thickens began operating under the assumption that the killer knew Jessie and targeted Jessie. That they would have known where she was in the house, they knew how to get in the house, and they went straight for her, they killed her, and they left. When Detective Thickens spoke with Buck and Joy just hours after they had discovered their daughter dead, he asked them if they had any idea who would want to hurt their daughter. And at first, the parents said, no, we don't know anyone. But after some more prodding, Buck would say, well, recently there were some tree limb cutters that were cutting limbs right outside of Jessie's bedroom window. And so maybe they looked in and they saw a teenage girl who was all alone, and they came in and they attacked her. And then Buck also said that in addition to teaching music that summer, Jessie had picked up a few hours working at a restaurant down the road. And recently she had come into conflict with one of her coworkers who began acting very inappropriately with her. He basically would walk past Jessie and intentionally bump into her and rub into her and just get inside of her personal space. And this coworker was aware of the fact that Jessie was really upset and had already told her family. And so perhaps this coworker was disgruntled and was seeking revenge. Also, Joy would point out to the detective that the night before, when Jessie came home, she had seemed really upset about something. She had said it was about these two guys that, were hitting on her at the party, and it made her uncomfortable. But Joy and Jessie didn't really get into it. So there was something obviously on her mind the night that she was killed. Following this discussion, Detective Thickens would go out and track down those tree trimmers. He would also track down the co-worker at the restaurant, and he discovered that they had rock-solid alibis and they were ruled out as suspects. As for the two older guys, the cast members from the pool party that had made Jesse uncomfortable, Detective Thickens found them, and he very quickly ruled out one of them, but he was not able to rule out the other. His name was Randy Talley. When Detective Thickens spoke to Randy on July 15th, the day that Jesse was found, Randy would deny having anything to do with Jesse's death. When Detective Thickens asked him, where were you the night before after the cast party? Where'd you go? And then where were you this morning? Randy would tell him that after the party, he went back to his apartment, and that is where he has been the entire time until right then. When Detective Thickens asked him if there was anyone that could corroborate his story, Randy said no, he was alone in his apartment the entire time. Shortly after speaking with Randy, the police were still searching Jesse's bedroom for evidence, and they discovered her diary. And her final entry in this diary only made Randy seem more suspicious. Despite downplaying the incident that Jesse had had with these two older cast members at the pool party, after Jessie had spoken with her mom briefly when she got back from the party, she had gone up to her room and then made this final diary entry. And in it, she talks about being really upset about what these two guys had done to her. She said that these two guys were corrupting her and that they were taking what should be platonic love and perverting it into a competition. Her closing lines seemed to indicate that she might have been expecting some sort of future confrontation with these two guys. The lines read, "I am not helpless. I will recognize problems and confront them without fear. God be with me." Between Randy's lack of an alibi and then Jesse's kind of ominous final message that seemed to be talking about Randy, Randy quickly became the primary suspect in this murder investigation. But Randy's cell phone records indicated that he had not had any interaction, no calls, no text messages, with Jessie leading up to her death. And around the time in the morning of July 15th, when she would have been killed, Randy's cell phone was in his apartment, far away from Jessie's house. And so while this didn't definitively mean that Randy could not have killed Jessie because he could have just left his cell phone at his apartment when he carried out the attack, what it did mean was there wasn't any real evidence to support the idea that Randy killed Jessie. And so the Hartford police had to go back to the drawing board and try to find new leads to chase down. And on July 16th, just 24 hours after Jessie was discovered, the police would get a huge lead. Before we finish our story, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Current. Banking is still one of the very few industries that has yet to be modernized by technology. It's still dominated by a bunch of old companies that, if given the chance, would happily sneak into your house and replace all of your good socks with the type of socks that immediately slip down into your shoe after only a couple of steps. But Current, even if they wanted to screw with your sock drawer, they couldn't. They don't have time. They're too busy being the future of money management. Current was built from the ground up with you in mind. They want you to get your money faster, move your money faster, and they give you tools to help you save your money better than ever. With Current, there are a bunch of perks, such as you can expect to get your paycheck 2 days earlier, you won't be charged overdraft fees up to $200, and there are no minimum balance fees. Also, Current's savings plan is one of the best available. It's just called Interest, and it offers a massive 4% APY, which in layman's terms means it will generate you 60 times more money than the American national average. So go download Current with my code, MrBallenMoney, and then request $500 from my Current tag, which is just Mr. Ballen, and include in your request your best like button gag. I will choose which ones I like the most, and I will pay those people $500, and we will feature some of the best suggestions in our next Current sponsored video. Again, the code is MrBallenMoney. Go download Current today. Okay, back to the story. 3 days before Jessie was killed, A young woman about the same age as Jesse, named Melissa Richards, decided to take her dog for a walk in a park in Richfield, Wisconsin, which is a small town about 10 miles southeast of Hartford. When Melissa pulled her car into the dirt parking lot that connected to the walking trail she intended to go on, she noticed there was only one other car parked in this lot, and it was immediately on her left, pointed nose away from the entrance. It was this blue minivan. And so as she's driving in, she looked over at it and she noticed the driver had their legs poking out of the driver's side window as if they were laying down across the front seats. And so this didn't really matter to Melissa, but she definitely took note of this person in this van. And so she drives past the blue van on her left. She drives all the way across to the other side of the dirt lot. She parks her car, she hops out, she gets her little dog Remy out of the car, and then she walks away from the parking lot and heads onto the walking trail into the woods. The trail that she was walking on was basically a big loop that ended at the entrance to the dirt parking lot. And so when she was done with her walk, she would be walking directly across the entire parking lot, which would mean she would be walking on foot past that blue minivan if it was still there when she was done. And so Melissa does a 30-minute loop. She gets all the way around and she reaches the entrance to the parking lot, and she sees the blue minivan is still parked where it was, except the driver no longer has their feet poking out of the window. Now she can't see if there's anybody in the van at all. And so Melissa, again, she's not really thinking about this. It's crossing her mind, but she's not on edge about this van. And so she lets go of the leash of Remy, and Remy starts running to the car, and Melissa pulls out her key fob and she opens up the trunk to the car. And so Remy runs over, he leaps into the car, and then Melissa just continues to walk across the lot towards her vehicle. And when Melissa walks just far enough that she is past the blue minivan, she turns to look at it and she sees the person who had been sticking their legs out of the window, the driver, is now sitting in the passenger seat of the blue minivan. The door is open and this person is sitting there staring at Melissa. And so Melissa, she makes quick eye contact with this person and immediately averts her gaze. She doesn't want to be rude, and she just keeps on walking towards her vehicle. But again, she's not worried about what's happening with this van. She's just aware of this person and this van. But after averting her gaze, she hears the sound of someone running towards her from behind. And so she whips her head around and she sees the same person who was sitting in the passenger seat, the driver of this van, has run up to her. And as soon as she turned around to face this person, they came to a complete stop and they were just staring directly at Melissa. They were only about 10 feet apart. And Melissa kind of reflexively said, "Oh, you scared me." And then Melissa just turned her back on this person and continued walking towards her vehicle. And after taking only a couple of steps, once again, she heard the sound of this person behind her start running towards her. And immediately she whips her head around again and again. This person comes to an abrupt stop as soon as Melissa's looking at them. Except now Melissa knows something's not right. And worst of all, she looks down and in this person's right hand by their hip is a knife. A split second later, this person charges Melissa. They tackle Melissa to the ground. Melissa smashes down onto her stomach and she's pinned on her stomach. And this person, they attempt to stab Melissa, but Melissa fights back like mad. She turns over and she grabs the blade of the knife and she wrestles it away from her attacker, and she pulls the knife under her body and she puts it under all of her weight. And the attacker is so surprised that this has happened, they actually stop for a second before kind of reaching down and trying to yank the knife out from underneath Melissa, but Melissa is not letting it go. And so finally the attacker just kind of sits up on her back and says, "Can I just go?" And Melissa says, "No." But at that exact moment, the attacker leapt up and started running back towards the blue minivan. And so Melissa, she's not waiting around to see what they're going to do. And so she jumps up. She's still got the knife in her hand. Her hands are completely ruined. Melissa runs to her car. She leaps inside. She throws the bloody knife onto the floorboard of the passenger seat. After making sure Remy is in the car with her, she shuts the back hatch. She locks the doors, and then she turns around and she sees her attacker in the van peeling out of the lot driving away. And so Melissa is relieved, but she also just wants to get the heck away from where she is right now. She's totally alone. And so she fires up her car and she drives to the hospital. After getting 15 stitches to repair the 3 very deep cuts in her hands, Melissa was transferred to a recovery room where a man named Joel Klossing, who was a detective with the Washington County Sheriff Department, he came into the room and he took down Melissa's statement. Now, Melissa was very shaken up about what had just happened. She had no idea who this person was, why they attacked her. But despite being shaken up, Melissa had the most incredible memory of the event. She knew exactly what her attacker looked like, all the little details, and she knew everything about the vehicle, to include the fact that she knew it was a Dodge Caravan minivan. So she knew the exact type of car, and she guessed it was probably from the years 2000 to 2002. And so Melissa gives this incredible statement, and Detective Klossing, he goes back and he has a composite sketch made of the attacker, and then on this sheet that showed the attacker, there was a description of the vehicle and where it was located and some details of the case. And so Detective Klossing releases this sketch and the information to the media, and he puts it around town, and he's expecting someone in town to know who this person is because the description is so good. And someone would come forward. On July 16th, so one day after Jesse had been killed, a deputy from the Washington County Sheriff Department, he came forward and said, "Hey, I saw your flyer and I read the description Melissa gave about the type of vehicle this person was using, and I have seen that vehicle parked in the exact same spot in that park. I was there a couple of weeks ago. I saw it there. There was something weird about it. The driver was acting strange. And so I actually ran the license plates to see if there was some outstanding warrants or something going on with this person. But after I ran the plates, nothing came up. And so I kind of just forgot about it. But now I've read this description and I'm pretty convinced it's the same exact vehicle. And so I can pull those plates that I ran and we can see who owned that vehicle, and maybe it's a match." And so the deputy, he pulls up the information that he had pulled from the license plates of the van he had seen a couple of weeks earlier. And when they looked at the owner of that minivan, there was just no way they matched the description that Melissa gave. It just could not be the same person. And so briefly, Detective Klossing and the deputy believed that, okay, it was just some big coincidence that a very similar blue minivan was parked in the exact same spot a couple of weeks apart. But when Detective Klossing looked a little bit deeper into who the owner of that vehicle was, he would discover they had a relative that matched exactly the description that Melissa gave of her attacker. And so on the afternoon of July 16th, so one day after Jesse has been killed, Detective Klossing tracks down the phone number of the relative who looks exactly like the attacker, and he punches that number into his cell phone and he put the phone to his ear. At the same time, 10 miles to the northwest, Buck and Joy Blodgett were hosting a vigil for their daughter in their home. And so all of Jesse's very close friends and family, they were all there in the living room, and they were sitting around in a big circle, crying together, grieving together, and then also sharing their favorite memories of Jesse. And so while they're all doing that, a phone starts to ring inside of the circle. And the owner of that phone, 19-year-old Daniel Bartelt, who was a very close friend of Jesse's and who had spent much of that summer coming over to the Blodgett household to make original music with Jesse, he stands up and he walks quietly away from the group, and then he answers the phone, and it's Detective Klossing asking Daniel to come into the station to talk about Melissa Richards. Daniel would make his way to the police station that afternoon, and he would be interviewed by Detective Klossing and another detective. And even though they had brought Daniel in to talk to him about Melissa Richards, it was not lost on these detectives how strange it was that Daniel is at the home of a recently murdered young woman where that case is unsolved, and he is now the suspect of another attack on another young woman that happened only a couple of days earlier and only a couple of miles away. And so as soon as Daniel sits down, Detective Klossing kind of casually asks him, "Hey, why were you at Jesse Blodgett's house when I called you?" And Daniel would say, "Well, I'm very close with Jesse, and so we were there as part of her vigil because she was killed yesterday." And so the detective kind of did gradually shift to Melissa Richards, which Daniel would say he had nothing to do with. But as they began asking him questions about Melissa, Detective Klossing and the other detective noticed that there were cuts on Daniel's hands. And so they kind of cut him off and they asked Daniel, "How'd you get these cuts on your hands?"
And Daniel was very quick to say, well, I got them at work. A screw kind of jutted out and cut my hands. I move inventory around in a back room of an engineering company. That's my job. And, I just cut my hand at work. And so at that point, the police began really asking very pointed questions about exactly how he hurt his hands and what exactly did he do at his job. And at some point, when it just seemed like there was something off about his story about how he hurt himself, one of the detectives just says to Daniel, if I were to call your employer, this engineering company, would they say you, Daniel, are currently employed with them? And Daniel, he kind of paused for a minute and then said, no, I actually lost my job several weeks ago. And so now the detectives knew he had to be lying about how he cut his hand because he's just told them that he hurt it at work recently, but he wasn't employed recently. And so Detective Clausing kind of leans in and says, Daniel, so how'd you really hurt your hand? And so Daniel, he begins talking about how he cut it cooking. And Detective Clausing is like, Daniel, nobody would lie about cutting their hand cooking. So why don't you just tell us the truth? And amazingly, Daniel would. He would admit, after some serious pressure, that he hurt himself attacking Melissa Richards. He told detectives that after he lost his job a few weeks earlier, he didn't want his parents to know he had lost his job, and so he had just continued getting up early and leaving the house and coming back later in the day, kind of acting like he had been at work all day, when in reality all he was doing was driving around town and sometimes going to parks and just sitting in parking spots in parks. And so on July 12th, the day that Melissa was attacked, that's exactly what Daniel was doing. He was pretending to be at work by sitting in that parking space in that dirt lot in Richfield. And at some point, he saw Melissa and he decided he just wanted to attack her. He told detectives that recently he had become overwhelmed in college and so he had dropped out and then he lost his job. And so combined, he was just feeling kind of scared of life. That's how he described it. And so he wanted somebody else to feel scared too. And so that was why he said he attacked Melissa. But despite admitting to this vicious, violent crime against Melissa Richards, Daniel, when asked if he had any connection to the Jessie Blodgett murder, he would say, absolutely not. I love Jessie. I would never hurt her. But when Detective Clausing reached out to Detective Thickens of the Hartford Police and told them you should look at Daniel as a potential suspect in your murder case, it would quickly come to light that Daniel was lying again. Daniel was raised in a good, loving family. He was extremely smart, straight-A student. He was an incredible musician, and he was really well respected by his peers and even by his teachers and other instructors. I mean, this was a kid who had everything going for him. But something went wrong with Daniel, and no one knows exactly why. Shortly before he attacked Melissa, Daniel had become obsessed with killing and death and murder. His internet search history shows that he spent a lot of time looking for actual snuff videos online. Those are videos of actual murder. He also spent a lot of time looking up serial killers and spree killers, and he was especially interested in anybody who killed lots and lots of women. And then finally, right before he would attack Melissa, Daniel, based on his search history, had discovered this one particular pornographic snuff film, and it was of this woman who was all tied up and hogtied, and after being assaulted, she was strangled. And Daniel watched this video over and over and over and over again. On that day, July 12th, as Daniel is pretending to be at work, he's sitting in his car, he looks out and he sees Melissa, she's all alone, and something clicks in his head where he decides he's going to go reenact that wretched pornographic snuff film on Melissa. And so Melissa was likely just at the wrong place at the wrong time. Recovered in that dirt parking lot after the attack was this special, very strong tape that had been in Daniel's pockets during the attack. It had just fallen out. And so it's believed he was going to use that tape to subdue Melissa and then abduct her. But obviously Melissa fought back and Daniel got spooked and ran off. 3 days later, on July 15th, it's believed that Daniel decided he wanted to try again. He wanted to act out this pornographic snuff film, but in real life. And this time, he wasn't going to leave it up to some random victim. He needed his victim to be totally helpless. He needed his victim not to fight back. And who better than 19-year-old Jesse Blodgett, his close friend who inherently trusted him and would easily let him into her house, into her bedroom. It wouldn't matter if she was all alone because she felt safe around him. Based on eyewitness testimony of someone who was driving through the Blodgett neighborhood on the morning that Jesse was killed, it's believed Daniel arrived in the driveway of the Blodgett household just a few minutes after Buck and Joy had left for work. And so he pulled into the driveway knowing that Jesse was all alone. We don't know exactly what happened inside of that house. We don't know if Jesse came down and opened the door or if she was still upstairs sleeping. But Daniel, he entered the house, and when he went inside, he was prepared for what he was about to do. He literally had a bag full of supplies. Things like that special tape, there were ligatures, cords, ropes, there was alcohol wipes, zip ties. And so he makes his way upstairs to Jesse's bedroom, and then once he's in there, we don't know if Jesse was awake or sleeping at this time, but either way, Daniel jumped on top of her and immediately put a homemade ball gag into her mouth and then wrapped that special tape around her head to make sure the gag stayed in her mouth. And then once she couldn't make a sound, he bound her wrists and her ankles and he hogtied her, and then he viciously assaulted her. And then after he was done, he wrapped some cord around her neck and he strangled her to death. After she was deceased, Daniel attempted to clean her body with some alcohol wipes, and then after that he kind of repositioned her in her bed with the covers up over her to give the appearance that she was still sleeping to her parents when they inevitably would find her. Then Daniel rounded up all of his murder supplies back into his bag, except he did accidentally leave one of those special rolls of tape underneath Jesse's bed, and then he slipped out of the Blodgett household, and then he drove to Woodlawn Park, where he disposed of his supplies into one of the trash cans. The next day, at Jesse's vigil, Daniel would attend, and according to the other people that were there, Daniel was by far the most talkative person in that circle. Daniel would ultimately be found guilty of murdering Jesse Blodgett, although he never admitted guilt. In fact, during the sentencing phase, Buck Blodgett would give this incredibly eloquent and heart-wrenching speech about what it was like to lose his only child. And toward the end of this speech, Buck turned to his right, so away from the judge who he had been addressing, and he looked directly at Daniel. And Daniel looked back at him, and Buck says, "Dan, I forgive you as I have every day since I found out it was you." And then a few moments later, Buck would also say to Dan, "Dan, not only do I forgive you, but I love you." But when Daniel got his turn to stand up and say something on his behalf, he turned to face Buck and Joy, and looking right at them, he would tell them that he's innocent and that he doesn't have any answers for them because he didn't do it and his conscience is clear. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and as far as we know, he still denies having killed Jesse despite the mountain of evidence against him. In the days following Jesse's death, Buck Blodgett walked into his daughter's bedroom and he laid down on her bed, and looking straight up, he tried to hold his breath for as long as he possibly could. And as he began to struggle, he started to imagine what it was like for his poor daughter in her final moments as she's being murdered, and it just crushed him. He thought to himself, I wasn't there for my little girl when she needed me the most. But instead of just carrying that terrible burden around with him for the rest of his life, Buck and his family decided they had to do something to honor their daughter's memory and maybe even change the world, which was something that Jesse always talked about wanting to do. And so Buck would go on to start the Love is Greater Than Hate project, which is this incredible charity whose mission is designed to end male-on-female violence and to inspire love over hate. Buck's charity is a recipient of a MrBallen's Foundation grant, and if you have been moved by the story in some way, I would highly encourage you to contribute to Buck's charity. You can find the link to their website below where you can